Program is Summer Dreams, the story of Bible Island. And Grosse Pointer Patrick Livingston will present a program relating to his latest book. White Woods, as the island was known, gained strategic importance when Fort Amherstburg was built in 1796 to guard passage along the Detroit River after Detroit became part of the United States. Grosse Pointers will fondly remember that this island was an amusement park from 1898, although I'm sure none of you saw it then, through 1993, and for most of this period was owned by the Browning family from Grosse Pointe. Today it is being developed as the Boblo Island and Marina Resort Community and is serviced by a private car ferry. Tonight's speaker, Patrick Livingston, is a native of Detroit who visited Boblo Island almost every year until it closed in 1993. During his formative years, he explored the island from top to bottom, including the forbidden fenced-off private areas. In the gray seasons, he would sometimes walk across the Ambassador Bridge, catch a bus to Amherstburg, where he would while away hours staring across the river, imagining the silent park, bringing it back into life in his imagination. One of the highlights of his early life came upon being hired as a crew member on the Boblo boat, the SS Columbia. Columbia became one of the ships that he profiled in his previous book, 8 Steamships Sailing Through the 60s, that is available tonight from Wayne State University Press. That book was selected as a Michigan Notable Book of 2005, and it was also a Bicknell Lecture topic that year. With that book successfully launched, Mr. Livingston began work on his next book, The Summer Dreams, the story of Boblo Island, which was also selected as a notable Michigan book in 2009. In spite of his Boblo fixation and steamboat experiences, Mr. Livingston, I keep saying that, Patrick, attended Monteith College at Wayne State University and then joined the U.S. Peace Corps as a agricultural technician in the Himalayan kingdom of Nepal. Upon return to the States, he began a career with Michigan State University's Extension Service as an educator with their Michigan Sea Grant and 4-H youth programs. He currently divides his time writing and assisting with the Great Lakes Education Program in the Detroit River and Lake Erie, and also has occasional stints as a guest teacher with the Grosse Pointe Public Schools. On the writing front, he is currently fashioning a Nepal journal into a book, or his Nepal journals into a book, and is seeking publication for his first novel that explores 24 thrilling hours on what else but Boblo Island.
Well, hey, it's great to see everyone here, and it is great to be back here at the War Memorial and a guest of the Grosse Pointe Historical Society once again. And this evening, as we are, as Mike so well illustrated, we're going to talk about Boblo Island and about key dates in not only your history, but in the history of arguably Detroit's first or second most popular island, depending on where you place the island. Okay. So with that, I'll just give a little bit of background. It'll work.
Worst case, I'll push it. Okay, get it. Yeah, we got the projector in front of the place where it signals to change light screens.
I hope I didn't go to sleep.
Let's see.
Go to sleep?
Might have gone to sleep.
There it goes.
There we go.
All
Maybe
right.
you just weren't hitting it hard enough.
Okay, got it.
There it goes. Okay, good. Push it harder. There we go.
Okay, with that, as Mike was mentioning, when I approached Wayne State University with the idea of potentially publishing what became 8 steamboats sailing through the 60s, after the negotiations had been done and we had decided to go ahead with that, and I went back over there to Woodward Avenue to the WSU Press offices and said, well, okay, I've also got this other book, and it's a novel, and it's about Boblo Island. And they very politely said, well, you know, I'm sure it's great, but we don't publish fiction. But But they said, but, we are looking for someone to do a history of Boblo Island. And I said, okay, yeah, sure, what do I have to do? And they said, well, just why don't you think about it? And I said, okay, is it okay if I go over to Boblo and, kick it around and just do that? And he said, sure, you can tell him you're working with WSU Press. And so one day I did. I went over there, it was a summer day, well, let me read you what I did. I sat down and decided to write, just scribble something, and it came out to be what I call Boblo, a place of power. It is warm. The sun is toasting the air. Only a cool breeze from Lake Erie is keeping me from stretching out on the lawn beneath this white oak and taking a siesta. I'm relaxing and recreating on an island in the mouth of the Detroit River. The name of the island is Boblo, changed from Bois Blanc a century ago, changed from whatever the first people in these parts called it back in their day. And I am drifting back into that thin, blanketed, fluffy cloud that is the past, my mind meandering to the life that has flowed through the ages over this very spot on the earth. Check the Discovery Channel. There are places on this planet where the forces of nature are hard at work, making the earth barely endurable to humans. And there are also places like our Great Lakes and their islands formed by power that struck long ago, places that have since settled down and allowed for human habitation. Boblo is one of those places created by the raw power of the earth long ago, when time as we know it did not exist. Yet now, having hosted violent upheavals of earth and councils of war, it has acquired a different sort of power and evolved into a zone of tranquility, a good place to sit and watch the river flow by on a warm August afternoon. I believe that there are different kinds of power at work on this planet. One kind of power overwhelms the senses and gives us places that we designate as the highest, deepest, greenest, bluest, and even the most historical or awesome. Another kind of power needs to be discovered in places that, at first glance, seem much more commonplace. Ordinary spots where one can sit on a balmy afternoon and feel a more subtle form of energy as it softly wells up from the earth below and suffuses the air with the unmistakable scent of summer. Okay, back to this. Okay, here's the captain. As part of my research, I was talking with some of the gentlemen who had worked for the Detroit Historical Society earlier. I did my primary research at several local places, most notably the Dawson Museum on Belle Isle, where the curator at the time, John Polisak, opened up unimaginable records and books to me. One of the things I found along the way was this brochure from the company that was done in the 1920s, and this was part of the brochure where the captain welcomes you to Boblo and to get on board. So I thought I would say, let's go. So we're down at the foot of Woodward. That is the steamer Columbia, of course, and it's my second steamboat. My first steamboat was the steamer South American, and that's number 67. You can see the crew entrance there, and the ship is ready to sail. And when it's ready to sail, what happens? Right. That 10-second blast of the whistle. Of course, the three blasts were like the 10-minute warning that made everybody run and go crazy trying to get onto the boat. But this one was a serious one. 10-second blasters in the boat was departing the dock. And of course, you had to cover your ears. Now, in other cases, I would say this is a reminder to turn off your cell phones. Okay, with that, we are underway. As the ship leaves departs the foot of Woodward, we're heading for Boblo Island. And that is the route. And I'm sorry about the size of this, but you might want to imagine that the top is the city of Detroit, the bottom is Boblo Island, and we're on an 18-mile journey heading down. It'll take us about an hour and a half to get there. I've been asked to go a bit more quickly tonight, so it won't take us quite that long. But you can see Boblo Island at the bottom, right across from Amherstburg, and along the way, all the various cities and places that the boat passes. Along the way, of course, if we drop back in time, then we're looking at the fortifications of the original Fort Malden, as it was designed in 1796. Actually, the British were requested to leave Detroit before that time, but they waited until they were sure that they had really lost the territory before heading across the river to Fort Malden. They chose the fort, of course, because it still controlled the main shipping route, even better than the city of Detroit did, for access to the Great Lakes. So very narrow stretch there of the river in the Amherstburg Channel, and what was at that time thought to be the only really navigable channel. So they set up Fort Malden there, and also, just to kind of consolidate their holdings, they decided to appropriate Boblo as well, Bois Blanc, as it was called at that time. You can see the lettering there is a corruption of the French on Boblo Island, because the French originally called it Ile of Bois Blanc without the X. A-U, not A-U-X. And there's a big difference there, because there's a difference between white woods and white wood in the naming of the island. When the Courrier de Bois came through, they named it the island Ile of Bois Blanc, singular, meaning island of white wood, not indicating that there were clumps of birch trees or other trees that weren't native to this area, but actually that there was a tree there that was valued for the quality of its wood that was white on the inside, the basswood tree. And that's how the island got its name. So the British corrupted it, of course, because they had no love for the French. Yeah. You say? Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah. And so the British were in possession of the island. As I mentioned, they appropriated it from the, we call them Native Americans. They were First Nation peoples at that time on that side. And it was a very questionable land grab, and it's still in the Canadian courts, surprisingly enough. But that's another story altogether. When the British finally did consolidate the island, they had a protracted dispute with the Americans over possession of it, and ultimately it was the King of the Netherlands who decided in 1831 that it belonged to the British. So once it was finally in their possession, then they went to work developing it. And one of the first things they did was put up this lighthouse on the southern end of the island, and that was 1836. They had a Detroiter, John Cook, who was awarded the contract. He got the limestone from Kingston, Ontario, and went to work on that. The actual lighthouse is about 40 feet high. It has about a 57-foot reach when you figure out the bluff that it sits on, so it can be seen about 18 miles out into the lake. That was very critical to shipping at that time, because those of you who have been that far downriver and seen the Amherstburg Channel know what a treacherous avenue that is for shipping, and the number of shipwrecks there probably are as great, if not greater, than any other place on the Great Lakes. So that lighthouse was very critical to
Sir, comment. You're doing a wonderful job.
Yes.
The temperature seems to be about 80 in here.
Oh,
Is there any way we can open those doors? It might help it.
okay.
Yep.
If you do fall asleep, I know it won't be because of me.
No, no. You're doing a great job.
Could you speak into the mic more directly, please?
I can work at that. Yep.
There we go.
Okay. How's that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. So that's the quick history of Boblo. 1836, the British have it. The lighthouse is built. There are more stories about that, but that's for the book. The other thing that happened in 1838, just 2 years later, is there was such a thing as the Patriot War. And with the Patriot War, a group of people from this side decided to liberate the Canadians from the yoke of the monarchy. And so they got a boat and took it around the backside of Boblo Island, and were attempting to capture Fort Malden with it. That was foiled. But as a result of it, all those white woods were cut. The British cut down all they deforested the island, so no ships could sneak up behind them again and go around the island that way. And the other thing that they did was that they put up 3 blockhouses on the island, one in the middle and another one on either end. So there were 3 blockhouses there in 1838. and there was a garrison station there as well. That is the only remaining blockhouse of the three. That's the one at the south end, and it is in very bad shape. It is pretty much collapsed unto itself. What happened then? Once the British moved out, 1851, they decided that there was better money to be made in other parts of the world, so they got out of this area, and then they offered the island for sale, and finally in about 1855, it went private for the first time. He defaulted, which was an interesting part of the history of the island when you think about the private ownership, because there was a big part of the history of the island is the number of defaults and bankruptcies that surround it, even up to this day. So he defaulted. Another guy took it over. He was an MP, a member of Parliament in Canada, and he ultimately sold it to his son. He bought it for about $2,000 in 1859. It was, and then his son and his wife, they were both actors of the American stage, they bought it and turned the island into kind of an artist resort colony in the 1870s. And this was one of the houses that was built at that time. So the mansions that you see today on Bablo are not the first of their type. This one was actually built using the corner of one of the blockhouses, the central blockhouse, right in the middle of the island. And it was the Rankin residence. And then, about 1890, two guys from Detroit, they were both, well, let's see, one was James Randall, he was known as the father of the Boulevard system, and the other, his partner was Colonel Atkinson. And they were both in business together. They decided to buy Bablo, and they did at that time for about $40,000. So Bablo had appreciated significantly in that time period, and then Atkinson took over this house, and Randall built a house on the south end of the island for himself called Lookout Cottage. There was a dispute. Property dispute, okay? As you can see here, the small print at the bottom is taken from a clipping from the Randall papers that I came across at the Burton collection, Detroit Public Library. And basically, it's they had a business falling out, and that resulted in Randall selling out most of the island to Atkinson, except for a small parcel on the south end, about I think about 3 acres, as I recall. And Randall decided to build a couple of cottages on there that he was going to sell to a couple of people, but Atkinson thought that he had gone a little bit too far over on his property line. So he sent a gang of guys over from Amherstburg one night, and this was the result. So that just goes to show you. And that wasn't the last time that happened either in the history of the island. So, okay, so we come through that part of the history. Randall and Atkinson went to court and were suing each other, and all kinds of calumny in the newspapers. You go in there and one's saying bad things about the other guy, and they're just carrying on. But ultimately, Randall kind of gave up. Atkinson died, and but before he did, he leased 25 acres of the island to the Detroit Belle Isle Windsor Ferry Company, because they were looking for a place to send their ferries on weekends and make better use of them. Detroit Windsor Belle Isle ferries, of course, ran across the river. That was their bread and butter. That was before, of course, before the bridge and tunnel were built, so they had pretty much a monopoly on that. They also had a ferry service to Belle Isle at that time, but that service was threatened. The city council at that time and the mayor at that time really didn't care for the way they were operating, thought they were getting too big a cut of the proceeds, and were threatening to cut the Belle Isle service off. So they started looking for other places to send their boats, and they saw Bablo, and they tried some places up in the flats, and they weren't successful there, so they ultimately came to Bablo and leased 25 acres, and they sent their first boat there in 1898. So now we're finally at Bablo. You got them. You thought you'd never get there. Oh, all right. So, now that we're at the island, now we can talk about what happened after all that prehistory and about the business of Buffalo. As I mentioned in my prologue to the book, I really became fascinated in the research and learning about how it was possible for people to make a living running an amusement park on an island that was basically only open 3 months out of the year. And not only that, but the island, of course, is owned by Canada. The boats were all coming from the U.S. They were passing through all kinds of different territories and subject to all kinds of restrictions. And that only got worse as time went on. So I became fascinated with just the business end of things. So this is the way the island looked when it was young. At the bottom there you can see that outline there that has the lighthouse, most prominent. At the very top was one of the first attractions that were built there, and it was a dance hall. Not the dance hall that any of you are familiar with. It was a wooden structure. It was built just off the boat dock, and of course it was there because any amusement park and island worth its weight had dancing to offer. So the dance hall was the first thing to go in. It was not a successful dance hall. People complained about it being too hot and not well ventilated enough, all those sorts of things. But it got the place up and running, so it was the first real attraction they had. And of course, they were advertising, I think this is 1902 already, but they're advertising one of the first St. Andrew's picnics. So the St. Andrew Society got a long history of having picnics there on the island. This is an earlier brochure, and again, if you'll just scan down the list of attractions there, what I'd like you to do is just really imagine going to a place today that offered just that, and then comparing that to what Disney World offers, and saying, could you do any of those things at Disney World? It's a whole different era, a whole different way of living, and recreation meant something totally different. That is not the Columbia or St. Clair, by the way. The predecessors to those ships were Detroit and Windsor Ferry Company boats. The Promise and the Pleasure were the ones that went down there most often. This is the women's cottage, of course. Yes. So, they really were, the president of the company, he was a ferryman himself, Walter Campbell, and he was dead set on making sure that Buffalo was a family destination. He wanted it to be something that was not for the rowdy types or anything like that. He wanted it to be for families. And so he put that woman's cottage up as an example of that. He also put up this children's playhouse. This is where the kids hung out. Imagine the thrills. Yeah. And of course then sports. Sports were big. So he had 5 regulation-sized baseball diamonds. He had grandstands there. They had tennis courts. So they had all kinds of exercise. Of course, you saw the bicycle track and things like that for amusement. However, Campbell was such a strict, strict may not be the right word, but he was certainly had a very strong Puritan streak in that even though the White City had debuted in Chicago at the World's Fair a good 10 years before, and Coney Island had also gone electric before that, he said that I will not have electricity on my island because I don't want lights. I don't want people staying out after dark. And that was his way of controlling it. He would not allow electricity on, okay, among other things. He was also very much against having any alcohol on the boats or on the island. That was just a given. But with he decided that he wanted to have some kind of an amusement ride, so he built this building to house it. Can anyone guess what that ride is? The carousel, right, yeah. That was known as the amusement building, and it didn't stay that way, at least in that incarnation, for a long time. But he built that. He commissioned a carousel to be built by folks in Coney Island, the Aliens Company, and that carousel came into being around, well, it was the end of 1905, the commission in 1906, the building was open. However, with that, when he got that carousel, he realized that he needed something to make it move. So he needed to, and there's the way it looked. And here's what powered it: the powerhouse. He built a powerhouse on the island, coal-fired, and it's interesting. We'll come back to that same powerhouse at the end of our presentation, and you can see the changes that it went through. But by that time, then that's when he went electric in 1906, and everything else followed from there. However, Campbell, as I mentioned, very puritanical. He wouldn't allow dancing on all the boats, even though there were orchestras and plenty of musicians around, because he said he wanted to leave some boats free for people who did not believe in dancing. So you could only dance on one boat going up and one boat going back, but not the other one. Also, well, we'll talk about the dance hall in a minute, but the other thing that happened at this time is that there's a very interesting dispute that happened when a man in Detroit got on the boat, and there was dancing going on, and one of the crew of the boat intervened and told a patron that he couldn't be doing the dance he was doing. It wasn't acceptable. And this other fellow named Meisner got up and interceded on the man's behalf and said, "You can't do that, you know." And so they threw him off the boat. So he turned around and sued Bothwell, and sued the company. And when the case finally came to court, the judges did agree that he was to be awarded back his fare, but they still were very unaccepting of the type of dancing done there. As a matter of fact, just let me read you a little thing about dancing back then. Let's see. There we are. Okay. There was a headline that said, "Stopped New Dance. Ping pong tabooed by ferry company." The dance in question was described as more of a muscular achievement than a ping pong game. A couple clinch, affect a tense expression, and then go hopping back and forth with short springy steps, attempting to imitate a ping pong ball as it bounces across the floor. The story interviewed a Professor Dufy, a dance teacher, who stated, "It is not a dance. It is a nuisance, a meaningless movement capable of nothing but inconveniencing other dancers." He claimed it originated on Bois Blanc on Decoration Day. Professor Dufy went on to state that he would not allow any freak dances in his academy, and that Detroit is given to freak dances to a greater degree than any other city in the country. Some things do not change. The picture up there is of a building probably most of you have never seen on the left there, and that is the pavilion for food. And it was a elaborate setting, and it was designed so that people could get on the boat and take the afternoon boat to Boblo, have dinner, and then hop on the evening boat back to Detroit. So that was quite a pastime at that time. Here's the interior of it. So it was very elaborate and very well set out. By 1909, Walter Campbell decided that he wanted to erect a tribute, a monument to the sailors of the Great Lakes, and so he had constructed on the island, on the east-facing shore, between the work dock and the regular dock, this anchor. Actually, two anchors. The interesting thing here is that you can see both of them in this picture. From the water you cannot, because one anchor is embedded in the monument itself. His intention was to link the past to the present at that point in time in 1909. So the past was that anchor at the top, and that's cypress wood from a steam barge known as the City of Cleveland, from a Civil War era barge. And the other anchor representing the present was taken from the steamer Columbia at that time in 1909, over 100 years ago. And that's the one that's embedded right into the face. It's a modern patent anchor, the black thing right in the center there.
Does that still exist?
It does. It's still there. By the way, if you do have questions, I'd be glad to take them after I'm done, but if they're burning questions, like it's too hot in here, we can take them sooner. That's fine. This is also from the booklet, called The Greatest Spot on Earth. So there's our captain saying, okay, are we ready to dance? And there's the dance hall. That's the dance hall that replaced the first one that people complained about. And it was, if you go over to Boblo today and actually the resort community and look at some of their literature, they have some very fantastic claims to make about this place. They claim that it was commissioned by Henry Ford for Albert Kahn to build in their literature. And so I really went through a lot of work to try to find out whether that was true or not. It's not true. And the actual architect was a Detroit architect named John Scott. And he also did the architecture for a lot of other buildings on the island. When this came online, it was known as the second largest dance hall in North America. Made of limestone from Amherstburg, and massive. So that is still in place, by the way. On the island, all of the principal buildings, except one that I can think of, are still there. All the stone buildings and things like that. Here's what the interior looked like. And of course, Walter Campbell made sure that he had security people to make sure that people were not doing the wrong types of dances on the floor. And he also instituted a policy that was pretty controversial at the time of charging people to use the dance floor. So that instituted another source of revenue. Okay, this is one of the second rides that Campbell put in. Actually, this building was constructed for it that was known as the Whip Building, because the ride was the whip. So it was a covered ride at that time. Later on in our era, it was moved outside, but that was the original building. When the when the first eating pavilion collapsed and fell into the river around 1940, then the whip was moved outside, and this became the food court that you were more familiar with just off the main boat dock. This is the souvenir building. This building no longer exists, and that really is a shame because it was a beautiful, as you can see, a beautiful design. And of course, another ride comes into being. The little kiddies get to play on the swings, but the young folks will go on the aeroplane swings. Fun. Okay, any clothing experts that can give me a date for that? Just by looking at the ring. Look like flappers. 24, there you are. And of course, some newspaper advertisements in comic format, so the family's going to Boblo. The 1920s, very interesting time because, of course, Prohibition was in effect then. And it became known that here's a family going to Boblo. Well, more than legend has it, a lot of people have told me that their grandfathers, when the family went over there, would be able to hop the ferry over to Amherstburg, where you could still get 4.4 beer in the taverns and still make it back, take the wife and kid home. Whole nother meaning to that comic there. There's another brochure pinpointing some of the attractions on the island at that time, in the 1920s. These are, almost all of these illustrations are in the book, by the way, so you have a chance to look at them in more detail. And here's an overview of the island. Of course, the dock is right there at the right-hand side, so the south end, where the lighthouse is at the left bottom, and the north end, where the Randall Mansion Lookout Cottage is located at the very top of the island there that we talked about. In 1926, well, I'll tell you that Walter Campbell finally died in 1923. By 1925 or so, they had beer on the boats. Didn't take long. Didn't take long for them to see the light of day. But they also put a golf course on the island, up there in the north end, above the boat dock. And things look good. They got some new rides as well. And of course, there was a beach on the island as well, on the west side of the island, a bathing beach. They had to close down the bathing beach because, you won't believe this, but 90 years ago, people downriver were still dying of cholera and typhoid as a result of Detroit's not having a wastewater treatment system. So nothing was treated when it left the city. And the people downriver who got their drinking water from there paid the price. So the bathing beach was closed down as well, around 1929 or so. That's an outline of the park and the golf course, so you can see all the major buildings on there at that time. And the Bug came in about 1928. One of the rides we were all familiar with. And what happened in the 1930s, of course, with the Depression, the Detroit Windsor Ferry Company still owned the park. However, a couple of things happened that really affected its ability to maintain ownership. One was the Ambassador Bridge, and the other was the Detroit Windsor Tunnel. Basically, it undermined their ability to have a reason for being for their car ferry service and passenger service across the river. So by 1934 or 1935, they were going and looking for the state to buy them out, basically. So that is indeed what happened. And at that point, a separate group of people spun off from the ferry company and purchased the island themselves. The island was closed for a couple of years during the Depression also. It could not make ends meet, but it came back in 1934. But by 1938, it was under new ownership. Now this building, again, is the amusement building, but it became the roller rink building. So this was the housing for the carousel, that first carousel that went in, and the carousel was moved to the middle of the island, and this building was converted to the roller rink. The Comet, actually. How many of you rode the Comet? No, I see one hand. Jeez. One of my favorite rides. You could operate it yourself, just like a sailboat. It was cool. Okay. In the 1940s, Boblo was successful, and of course it was the war years, so its most successful time for business was Sunday night when people were off from work. Sunday night became the most profitable time and the only time that a lot of people could go to Boblo. But what happened was that after that time, there was an accusation, a well-founded accusation by an individual who was denied the right to be on the boat, and she was from Detroit, a black person. The NAACP took her case to court. They won. The company refused to pay a $25 fine and appealed. It went to the state Supreme Court. They supported the lower court ruling. The company then decided to press on and took it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And by 1947, the verdict was against the company again. At that point in time, they said, well, we're getting out of here then. You know, who cares? Let the boat sink, let the island just go. We're not going to run the operation anymore. And so they just, at the last minute, put the park up for sale. So Boblo almost went under then. So if you're keeping count, that's the second time. The ferry company, of course, had to turn it over when they dissolved, and this was the second time that Boblo was threatened. But at the last minute, the Browning brothers came into being. As indicated, they were natives of the area. They already had the steamship company in place on the Great Lakes, and so they made the bid and basically rescued Boblo in 1949. I interviewed Bill and Ralph Browning extensively as part of my research, and they talked about that time, and Bill's recollection was how little time they had from the time that they bought the island early in the spring to get it ready for the season, and what a pressure point that was. Now we're into the 50s, and you can tell exactly what year it is by the clothing. Again. Okay, and the moon rock. C.E. Park was the ferry that ran from Amherstburg to the island, and it was named after a man who was, he actually supposedly collected the first ticket on the boat in 1898, and then he became the park superintendent in later years. So this boat was named after him. In the 50s, if you were on the Boblo boat, then going through the Amherstburg Channel, then you got to see a lot of good stuff going on, like this construction. They had the Army Corps of Engineers subcontracted to have these dredges go out and with their charges, and they were running dynamite into the river bottom and blowing it up at regular intervals to create the Amherstburg Channel, actually to make it deep enough for seaway shipping as part of the St. Lawrence Seaway, which came into being in 1959. And another brochure from the time of early 1960s, and on the left-hand side you can see in the middle picture there's a new ride called the Satellite Jets. And at the very top, right in the middle at the top, there's a group of kids, and right in the middle of them, I think, is Captain Boblo. Here's a better picture, though. He and his wife, Princess Louise. And of course, he was a mascot of the company for a long time, and a great guy. People have great stories about him. Wild Mouse was another new ride in the 60s, and that was Boblo's first big name ride, along with the Satellite Jets. That's when the Brownings decided to get serious about competing with Disney and other amusement parks that had been up and running for a few years at that time. And the interesting thing about Boblo, as you're figuring out here, is that the attraction was also part of the problem, in that it's an island, only accessible by boat. The boat becomes expensive to operate with a full crew of 30 crewmen, as well as other people who are part of the crew. So now we're dealing with the issue of maintaining the boats and the cost and the amusement park as well. So Boblo was unique in that way, in that they weren't a land-based amusement park that was accessible by auto or other means. You had to get on a boat to get to Boblo. Here's an overview of the island in the Browning era, toward the end of their era. And they held the island for about 31 years. up until 1979. Another brochure from celebrating 75 years, which would make it 73 if we're counting from 1898. And another one, the Brownings finally were successful in getting a roller coaster on Boblo. Another one of the things that I see on a website, the Roller Coaster Enthusiast of Canada or something like that, they claim that they have a history of roller coasters on Boblo in the 1920s and things, but that is not the case. The first coaster went in the 1970s in the Boblo. The one they're thinking about is a picture of a coaster at Sugar Island. And here's a picture of the park at that time, seen from above. And you can now tell that we're looking into the 80s because that white spire there near the top of the picture right in the middle is the Sky Tower. That was put in, I think, during the AAA era. You can see the roller coaster in the background there. Now we're back to our powerhouse, which has been converted. Because the island finally got hydropower. I mean, hydro means water, but to Canadians it means electricity. So they all call it hydro. They finally connected to the hydro sources in the 1950s. So the power plant became obsolete and it was turned into different things. It's a powerhouse emporium here. Later on it became a walk-through funhouse. That was a great one. And another brochure from the 80s. And when the Brownings sold the company in '79, they sold it to a consortium that was run by a couple of guys out of Minnesota. So they were not familiar with the area. We're real familiar with running an amusement park, and within 2 years they had pretty much run it into the ground. They just had a real bad run of luck, and were facing receivership by 1981. It took them until '83, when the park was just on the verge of being liquidated, that AAA came in. AAA Michigan came in and bought the park and brought it back into what some people say is its greatest era. When we talk about great eras there, we're talking about numbers of people coming, through the gates. While they all hoped for having a season of 1 million people, I think AAA probably had about the best at about 750,000. And of course, the other events, the real bread and butter for the company in terms of making ends meet were the moonlight cruises, as well as the charters. They were totally dependent upon that. The people like us who just walked up and bought tickets with our families weren't enough to sustain them. So they really needed that moonlight booking throughout the season to make ends meet, as well as the charters from companies and group picnics and things like that. When AAA sold the company in '88, or sold Boblo in '88, that was a kind of a shock to Detroit. But AAA said they never intended to hang on to it. They just wanted to restore it to what they thought it could be, and that was their goal and objective. But unfortunately, the people who bought it, the company that also owns the Harlem Globetrotters and some other attractions, this was their first amusement park. Again, they were out-of-towners. They really didn't know what they were doing and getting involved in the island. And ran into trouble, ran into bankruptcy. They put Boblo up for sale, and there were no takers. They stopped the boats from running, the big boats, the Columbia and St. Clair, in 1991. At that point, most people who lived in Detroit said, well, the boats are gone, the island must be closed. And so people stopped going to Boblo, in huge numbers. So that in '92, that looked like the last season. However, in bankruptcy court, a couple of guys from Seattle, Washington bought the park, and they did have some experience in amusement parks, and the 1993 season was thought to be kind of a comeback season for Boblo. They were getting respectable numbers, they were doing some innovative things. Most importantly, as I mentioned, with the boat situation, Bill Browning told me that the boats were one of the biggest headaches of his job because, as I mentioned, not only did he have to run through two countries, the waters of two countries, but also all these municipalities that had their various zoning laws that could bring him to court. He had to comply with the Coast Guard regulations from both countries. He had a total of 8 unions that he was working with on the boats alone. So he had his hands full just with the boats. But he recognized the fact that people in Detroit only knew of one way to get the bobble, and that was on the boats. So it was kind of if I pull the boats, I'm going to lose the whole operation, and that was the stress. And ultimately, that is what happened with that bankruptcy. They had to discontinue the boats because they were too expensive. And when that happened, then the bottom fell out. The guys in 1993 who bought the island actually had a plan that might have worked, and it was mostly viable because of the fact that the boats were no longer around as a liability. So they were going to consolidate the entire operation on the Canadian side, including the transportation. So if you wanted to go to Bobble, you'd have to go across the bridge or through the tunnel. But I think they probably would have been successful with the numbers had they been able to follow through with that plan. Unfortunately, the principal owner, he wasn't the owner, he was actually using money from a lender in Washington. He was in a very bad car accident right at the end of the season, and he was virtually paralyzed. And as soon as that became known, his backers pulled the plug on the operation and liquidated everything within a month. So that became the end of the amusement park era. So with that, what happened after? Well, the island was purchased for $2.5 million by a guy from the Detroit area. And his plan was to develop it into a residential resort, something like Mackinac Island, a little village center and things like that. But he was not successful in his endeavor. He had a lot of bad luck with a lot of things that happened, and ultimately his principal contractor was awarded the island in a bankruptcy for proceeding. And he continues to have the island. He continues to develop houses on it. And it's Boblo is slowly but surely becoming inhabited by seasonal residents in houses. I'm not going to talk a whole lot more about that. I am going to answer questions about the boats. This is the one picture of the boats I'm going to show. As well, in their most recent incarnation, both the Columbia and St. Clair are still around the area. They're both sitting in a slip at the Nicholson Yards in River Rouge. And they are both, well, they have individual owners. The Columbia is owned by a guy from New York City who hopes to revive it for service on the Hudson River. The reason he wants to do that is that the boats were designed by the same man who designed the Hudson River dayliners. So they would be familiar to people from that area as well. But he's had it for a few years now, and we have not seen a whole lot of anything happening to it. So we don't know if his plans, he does come around. I talk to him once in a while, and he still sounds like he wants to do something, but we haven't seen much activity. The St. Clair is owned by a doctor from Henry Ford Hospital. And he has been working on it quite a bit, trying to strip the decks and redo the decks, basically. Everything's rotted away but this wood. It's a monumental task. And I think, well, we can wish him well. I've been on the boats and talked with him, and a great guy. He's got a lot of interested volunteers willing to work with him, but his work schedule doesn't permit him the amount of time that he needs to really dedicate to a project like that. Here's the greatest spot on earth. That is the cover of that 1929 era brochure I was talking about. It also is the cover of that novel about Boblo that I'm writing, or that I've written, that I'm waiting to publish. So if you know of a publisher out there, or an agent, fiction, remember it's fiction. Okay, 24 hours in the life of Boblo. Since it's seasonal, a little Christmas scene. There's a postcard sent out by the Detroit and Windsor Ferry Company at that time. At the mouth of a great river lies a gem, the fairies' garden, frolicking within their palace, snow-bedecked and all aglow, sending Christmas greetings to you from our island park, Boblo, Detroit and Windsor Ferry Company. Okay, so even though it's not quite Thanksgiving, it's almost there. How did that get up there? Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. Let's see, I'm not sure if I answered all questions, so do we have a few minutes for questions, Mike?
Sure.
Great.
Yep. Got a couple more questions here. Marty in the back? Okay.
What was the era of the ice, of the roller rink?
The era of the roller rink was about 1938, I believe, to roughly 1979 when the Brownings sold it. I think that once they sold it, then it was converted to a theater. The building became a theater for about 10 years, and then about 10 years, well, then it became the site of a magic show. Mark Wilson's magic show was there. Yes.
Did you put anything in the book about the old lady that lived there forever?
Yeah, Dorothy Tresness. Yeah, I interviewed her several years back. She's passed away, unfortunately, just this last year, I think. And great story. But that's the woman who was denied access to electricity when, well, actually it happened in 1993 when the guys from Seattle came in. They decided that the island was theirs, and they really didn't see why she should be living off their grid. So they cut off her access to electricity, and that was a big dispute. She didn't have water as well, and so people from Grosse would go by her dock and drop off jugs of water and things. She talked about ultimately when she did have electricity and water restored, she told me, she said, that was just great not having to go down to the river to bathe. She was in her late 70s, early 80s at that time. Okay. Yes?
How did they come up with the name Boblo?
Oh, okay, yeah. Boblo is a corruption of Bois Blanc. I have a little anecdote from one of the newspapers in 1908 that talks about how that was basically just a corruption of the French, that people who were not Francophone were just kind of corrupting it and saying not Bois Blanc but Boblo. That was something that Walter Campbell didn't agree with. He said, no, it's Bois Blanc, and he was very specific about that. And it wasn't until after he died that the word Boblo started appearing in the company literature around 1927. So as far as the company was concerned, it was always Bois Blanc. Yes.
Who is the Livingston channel named after?
That's William Livingstone with an E, and he's got the he's the same guy after whom the lighthouse on Belle Isle is named after. He was the president of the Lake Carriers Association in the late 1800s, and he was a huge advocate for the channel being built. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, the first ship that went through the channel was the William Livingstone. That was 1912. That was just at the same time that the dance hall was being built. Or
Okay, one last question.
Way in the back?
And what year was the zoo added?
Oh boy. Okay, that was in the Browning era. I'm not absolutely sure of what year that was. It was the 70s, as I recall. But I can't tell you definitively without looking at the book. So maybe after a while.
Well, one other question. In comparison to Belle Isle would be, what, twice as big?
About 5 times as big.
5 times as big.
Belle Isle's about 1,000 acres in size, and Bobolin is about 200 acres.
Oh, I see. So it is a big difference.
Well, both of Pat's books are for sale. I want to wish you a happy Thanksgiving, Merry Christmas, and hope you'll join us again in the spring for our programs then. Thank you so much for coming.